Today is the 31st of July 2018, and John and myself, Ginny, are here to talk again about the Shakti Cluster app. Who done it?
Follow up on the who done it.
Follow up on the who done it. So we'll start with Kamala, because insanely, Kamala got missed out of the talk, and then even more weirdly, Hans, who put the last talk into two separate talks, it just so happened that the first one ended on number 9. Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
And the next one, the gap of Kamala missing was perfect in how he split up those talks. So
it was a perfect error.
It was a perfect error, and I'm quite glad it happened in a way, because there's many things about Kamala that are incredible, amazing, and we'll catch up with those now.
Yeah, they've come to the surface by virtue of having made this so-called error.
Yeah.
I think I pointed out when I was characterizing the super learning event, I pointed out something which I would also characterize just as a general feature of the Gnostic practice, the Gnostic method. When you make an error, when a Gnostic makes an error, of course you attempt to correct that error. So self-correction is a feature of a Gnostic person, as it were. Mm-hmm. And that self-correction is in all matters: personal, moral, psychological, historical, emotional. The human animal, the Rome, is a self-correcting animal. And if you're not, then you're not living up to the Rome, or living up to humanity, as some people would say. But to get to the point, I mentioned that the self-correction process is also an amplification process, which is we're demonstrating here. We're not only correcting the omission of Kamala, but we're bringing in material that we wouldn't have had access to at that time. Mm. So the error is not just a straight correction, but it always brings more knowledge. It always brings an amplification and deepening of what you know. And so I'm going to give the cue to Ginny here to read a passage that goes back to a nav briefing, right? Called Kamala's Wedding.
Yeah. Kamala has a special mission for us in Sophia's correction and the 200 years left of Kali Yuga. The mission is learning passage of command, and by learning it and demonstrating, we demonstrate to Sophia herself that our confidence in ourselves is real and provable, and that we have an immortal reach of power through the love of each other, on the condition that we include in that love the responsibility to take life.
So there, you went back and found this passage as part of the follow-up to the talk about the functions of the various Mahavidyas and Devatas. The Devatas, which includes the Mahavidyas and the Diamond Sky, Dakinis. And I want to point out here that in this continuing talk, which only goes out to people on the mailing list, we're kind of toggling back and forth between the Shakti Cluster app itself and the formation of the Thunderbird. So we'll kind of be interchangeably talking between those two different formats.
Like a piston.
Like a piston, right. A happy piston. So, yeah, I'd like to add something about current timing. Just in the last week or 10 days, Jupiter has come out of its retrograde cycle. And as we sit here and speak right now, Jupiter is still in the scales. And I think it's in the right pan of the scales, because it retrograded back into the right pan. So now that Jupiter's turned direct, it's going to go across the fulcrum of the scales. It's going to pick up speed. It's going to go to the left pan, which is jarred by the claw of the scorpion, and then it will pass into the scorpion. And this is going to happen quite quickly in the course of this year. So I think by November or so, Jupiter will transit into the Scorpion. And you might remember I asked the question the other day as we were just sitting around, well, I wonder what Jupiter in the Scorpion is going to bring. We always follow the protocol that I set up in the GNE, which is we watch Jupiter. We actually watch it with our eyes. We track Jupiter to know what the lessons and breakthroughs in correction are going to be. So I think it's rather remarkable that this has come up in this way. And by excluding Kamala, we now have the opportunity to amplify more about her qualities and her powers.
So Kamala is the constellation
Of the Scorpion.
Of the Scorpion.
Right. And the original notes I wrote for Kamala are right here in front of me. She's 10 in the Shakti cluster, and these are the notes regarding the Thunderbird formation. Also, I gave her a number of pseudonyms here, which I'll repeat. Emanjá. Emanjá is a Brazilian goddess of erotic power and beauty. There are many songs about her in Portuguese. She's kind of a bossa nova babe. I know you don't care for bossa nova, but... Kula Devi, which is a reference to her power. Kundalini Devi, Aphrodite, Astarte, Astaroth. So, what I originally wrote, Kamala is assigned to Kala Tantra, or those in the Kamala band, are assigned to Kala Tantra, erotic arts, sexual education, porn education, that is to say both the attacking of the porn industry for its evils, but also the correct education that porn would be if it were truly sexology. We don't have sexology. We don't have a hygienic sexology for young people. We have porn, see? So the correction of porn into a hygienic sexology teaching is part of the mission of this band, right? And of course, combating the evils of porn and the porn industry, which is largely run by Juno Who.
Juno.
Right, Juno Who. It targets degenerate policies of sex education, and also it attacks the gender equality and LGBT agenda of the leftists and the Marxists. So those are some of the active fronts for those in the Kamala band, and that could be widely expanded beyond that.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to distract you off topic too much, but for those people who didn't study the GNE and understand what tracking Jupiter meant, correction happens in the apsides of Jupiter, and that's why you taught us to track Jupiter and actually physically follow with your naked eye what Jupiter is doing. So Jupiter in the scales at the moment, just if you can succinctly explain what that might mean.
Well, I experienced Jupiter in the scales as the breakthrough moment for me in what I would like to say and teach and propagate and leave as a legacy regarding Gaian ethics. You know, because the scales is the constellational image. It's the only human-made image. It's the image of human conscience. With your conscience, you weigh things in the scales of your conscience. And so what I'm finding is that I'm arriving after great length and great difficulty and hesitation and doubt a clear formulation of how to teach and present Gaian ethics. And that is what I am taking, anyway, from the lesson of Jupiter in scales right now.
Okay, good. Okay, so in terms of using the app and commanding Kamala.
Right.
So she oversees group concerns.
Group concerns. Yeah. Right. So, and this problematical factor of love. Right. Yeah. She actually is a love goddess.
Yeah.
Lakshmi is one of her Hindu pseudonyms, right? Lakshmi.
So through love we are released, but there is no release without gratitude.
This is from the Ginny talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love doing this to John. I love quoting back his words to him, and he sits there going...
Who said that?
Yeah.
Give me a moment to take that in. Well, keep going, because this is fruitful. This is priming my mind here.
Okay, so she speaks in intimacy, releases her Dakini elixirs into the zone of personal emotional life. When you realise you have no life of your own, you have made a personal pact with VV that allows you to fulfil your life. You have aim. Kamala instructs us to achieve the wedding, i.e. the melding of love and resources in a transpersonal way.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's deep stuff. I'm getting a sense that one would command Kamala for direction in the matters of love, and that would be personal, intimate love, one-on-one, but also in the way that that love that is held between people can become an instrument for the group or the community, you see. It's not just confined to their power. So I hold by my view very strongly, because I remember at a cellular level how this intel came to me. I hold to this view that the instruction of Kamala comes between the dialogue, comes within the dialogue of loving people and loving encounters.
Well, I've actually got the quote here.
Oh, do you?
Of the intel that you got.
Yeah.
So, quote, I teach the passage of command in the union of love and death. She teaches in dialogue, and her teaching arises as a spontaneous, shared realisation in the intimate dialogue of two people in love, particularly when the subject of love and death comes up, including both aspects of death. You die, and you can cause to die.
So I would say that you would command Kamala for your instruction and guidance, and she is an extremely subtle handler. I would compare her to Idris in the subtlety of her handling. You would command her for confronting death, confronting the death of a loved one, or even the possibility of the death of a loved one, and death and loss, steering you through those matters. How would you command? Well, you don't ask for anything. You just command. I command your strength. I command your guidance. I command you to steady me.
Yeah, we'll talk about command syntax later on. Yeah.
So these are the matters that are appropriate to her realm. The art of learning to use the Shakti cluster might be compared to the art of painting. You stand there in front of a canvas, and I love this because I love to paint. You stand there in front of a canvas, and you have over here a palette, and the palette has these colors on it. And, you know, as you learn to paint, you learn to choose the colors that you paint with. So you learn to choose the Devatas that you work with as you live with the Shakti cluster. It's an art, and everyone practices the art in their own way.
The art of Zoroastrian magic.
Exactly. And also, you learn, one of the great pleasures of painting is to mix colors. I love to mix colors and watch them mix. So you can mix as your mastery of it grows, you can mix. But at the start, I would advise you to focus on one at a time before you start mixing them. Okay? Final comment I want to make is that I think that it's really important extremely important to bear in mind in the vein of Kamala's instruction that intimacy is her genre. So if you have the good fortune to have an intimate love relationship, and you're sitting around on a wonderful summer evening or on a winter morning or whatever season of the year, of course winter is Kamala's season, you drench yourself in the beauty of that intimacy, and in the conversation that you have, her instruction reveals itself in your conversation.
That's right, yeah.
Right. But equally so, there is such a thing as a loving encounter. You can have a loving encounter that does not necessarily require a long-term, stable, reliable, loving relationship. And in the loving encounter, the same dynamic comes into play. So look for the loving encounter. If you don't have a loving partner, it's okay.
Okay, one more comment on Camilla. So, Camilla's constellation area is the snake tamer and the scorpion, because the composite stars overlap the leg of the snake tamer, so you only get 13 days.
That's right. Technically speaking, the sun is only in the constellation of the scorpion for 13 days.
Then it shifts into the
Then
composite
it
stars of
shifts
the snake
into
tamer.
the snake tamer, and that's Udasi. And there's a really complex and beautiful relationship there, because in fact the two constellations are one in the sky. So, but yet these Devatas do have their distinct functions.
Okay, so let's move on to something that we didn't say in the last talk.
About Bhairavi.
Bhairavi. Listen,
Bhairavi.
we're being corrected about how to pronounce these
Hindu names, Hindu Sanskrit
Hindu
names.
Sanskrit names, and I learned a bit of Sanskrit when teaching yoga. So you do put the emphasis on the first
On the
part,
first syllable.
but we're Kalikas, we can do what the fuck we
we can
want.
say Bhairavi if you like. Right. So, Bhairavi, we included Bhairavi.
Yes, we did, but we didn't talk about this.
We excluded a really important factor in the mission of those in her band, and that is, I give it over to Ginny.
Animal rights.
Yes. Now, this term animal rights has just come up recently due to a certain document that I placed in your hands.
Yeah.
And if you'd care to talk a little about that, I would be most pleased.
Okay, well, this the person that wrote this document, I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with her, because I first encountered her a couple of years ago when you were teaching the Celestics course, because one of our gorgeous, lovely friends and colleagues chose this person as their exemplar to study Celestics. And you happened to have in your house at that time, or still have, a biography of this person. And I remember I threw it at the wall. I was so pissed off with it.
It put me off too.
Yeah. And now we know that he's the person that wrote that book. He's also written quite a few books that we've read.
About Nazi ideology.
About Nazi ideology.
And he's a skunker.
Yeah.
Not to
A
insult
dead
skunks.
one,
Yeah.
thankfully. So the book is called Impeachment of Man, and it's by Savitri Devi, who has been called by the biographer of this particular book we were talking about, Hitler's High Priestess.
That's the title of the book.
Yeah. Now, if you look on Wikipedia, it says that Savitri Devi was actually the pseudonym of a Greek man, which is absolute nonsense. So this book, Impeachment of Man, was written in 1945 and 1946. And she talks about, in the most brutal, warrioress style, about how abhorrent she finds mankind and their treatment of anything in the natural world. So not just animals, but
Right.
everything.
Right.
On one of the first pages, she's got a beautiful photograph of a tiger, and underneath it, she wrote "Animal Aristocracy." So I'm just going to read a little bit from the preface and then one other paragraph. So she's talking about when she wrote this book, when it was first printed. It was inspired by the events, and namely of the months immediately following the Second World War, of the time during which, even if one deliberately refused, as I did, to open any newspaper or magazine or to listen to any propaganda on the wireless, one could not but hear, wherever one turned, more or less cleverly presented tales of, quote, crimes against humanity, unquote, alleged to have been committed, sometimes admittedly, by or at the orders of the Japanese so-called war criminals, but mostly, practically always, by the German so-called such ones. So then she talks about National Socialism. She was aligned with Adolf Hitler, who, the Germans were the first people to have preservation areas for species that were being hunted out of existence.
When they built the Autobahns, they were careful to preserve certain features of the natural environment, not just to pave it over recklessly and carelessly.
He banned vivisection in Germany. And
Wildlife protection.
there's a quote from Goebbels in this book. Let me see if I can find it. Joseph Goebbels, entry in his diary in 1942. An extended chapter of our talk was devoted by the Führer to the vegetarian question. He believes more than ever that meat eating is wrong. Of course, he knows that during the war we cannot completely upset our food system. After the war, however, he intends to tackle this problem also. Maybe he is right. Certainly the arguments that he adduces in favour of his standpoint are very compelling.
So there was a huge case in the mind of Adolf Hitler for this ethic of animal protection and animal rights, which is the subject of this book, Impeachment of Man by Savitri Devi. And I haven't read it. I gave this copy that I found to Ginny, and she's saying there's some really powerful passages in here, and you're having to read it several times.
I need to read it 3 times. It's so big and brutal. She's brutal about humanity.
That's why I said it's something you could have written. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I just read this lovely passage about...
Sure.
Okay. In this present day nightmarish world, the outcome of the victory of the dark powers, we cannot, unfortunately, say a single word to the glory of the greatest of all Western men of love and of vision, of the inspired prophet, in brackets, for that is what he was, who fought for the reinstallation of a world order in tune with the divine order of nature, a world in which beautiful, healthy beasts had rights, while decadent men had none. Whatever we could say about would be bitterly held against us and our brothers in faith, and against the very cause of life which we intend to serve. Those who know will understand us without our mentioning the godlike leader's name. Those who do not know yet will know one day, in brackets, if they have at all any wits, and admit that we were right, and place the one great vegetarian ruler the West has ever had ahead of those most uncompromising expounders of the life-centred outlook who are, at the same time, men of action.
So these are the words of a woman who was really staying on the front line of what we call World War II, which was really a continuation of World War I, which was really an action taken with the ultimate ulterior motive to destroy the German people and ultimately the white race. And what I admire about her, and I get it now from shaking off the bad impression that I got from this biography of her, which is tainted. Right?
Horribly tainted.
Right. What I get now is that Savitri Devi was in her own way a visionary, and she saw the cause of, of the National Socialist Party and the revival of the German heroic spirit. She saw it absolutely in unity with a vision of life that included what she calls animal rights. And so we've been talking about this, and you made the point, Ginny, that animal rights exist, but human rights don't exist. Would you care to comment on that?
Animals have to have rights given to them by humans to protect them from humans. Humans do not have rights, they only have agreements.
Exactly. That's the exact syntax. Animals cannot speak. They can speak in their own way, but they can't articulate sufficiently.
They can't vocally speak. They can telepathically speak, but they can't vocally speak like humans.
And they can make many articulate noises, right?
Yep.
But the fact is that because they are limited in that way, in their animal design, and we as human animals have this capacity for language and concept, then we are in a position where we can assign rights to animals to protect them and to make sure that we hold them in the right place in our world. Whereas the idea of human rights is, I must say, frankly, just a Jewish con. The problem with human rights is that human rights are always presented in the framework of an act of pretending. It's like pretending that they exist without definition or agreement. They're simply agreements. There are no God-given human rights. So if we agree that you have a right to piss on my lawn, then you can piss on my lawn because it's an agreement that we made. But if you were to come over to me and say, I have a God-given right to piss on your lawn, I would be upset. But that is exactly what people say all the time.
Well, it's a disguise for the parasite, isn't it?
It is. Because it is the parasite that has created, as an attack upon human conscience, this false notion of rights. There are no human rights. It's a delusion and a con. There are only agreements. That's all. And that's a factor, that is in fact a key factor of Gaian ethics, and I'm glad that we can state that here and get that on record today. So this is tremendous, and it brings us around to the Bhairavi band, to which you belong.
Yeah, and she's my personal guardian.
And she's your personal guardian. And so those in the Bhairavi band define and fight for the rights of animals and the whole non-human world. They've got a big agenda.
Everything with Bhairavi is a big agenda, though, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's a long-term, it's a long-term goal. She ends secrecy.
Absolutely. Overcoming secrecy, overcoming the deceit of human rights, as we were just saying. It's a massive front. The Bhairavi front of the KWP is really massive. But I'm glad that we could pick this up again and include this, because this factor of animal rights and protection of animals, even though I'm not a vegetarian and you are, is a point upon which we totally agree.
Yeah. So you can command Bhairavi if you see an animal suffering, or if you know about animals suffering,
Being mistreated,
you use her, you command her to assist the animal.
to intervene.
It's so weird. The other day, there's an animal that lives close to here that's... I don't want to go into too many details, but...
It's a magnificent creature.
Yeah.
Yes.
And anyway, I came back and said to you, I'm going to use the Shakti Cluster app to get him a better life, which I did with his previous entity, actually.
Right.
And he's gone now, sadly. I went back the next day to see him, and already he's got a slightly better life, and that was without me actually using the app. So what's going to happen when I use the app?
By even saying or suggesting that you would use the app to intervene, there was an immediate improvement of the animal's conditions that it's kept in.
Yeah.
So, this is not wishful thinking, this is not pretending or New Age magic, but I know that it must in some respects appear to be that way. Even to me sometimes it does.
We'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that.
So I've got a list of questions that people wrote in with. Some of them have been brilliant, actually, thank you. Somebody asked, you keep talking about the three attentions, and there's so much work you've done, it's hard to know where to go and re-listen to understand what things mean. So could you give a short synopsis for dummies, she said, of the three attentions?
Yeah, I love the model of the three attentions, which, as you may know, was initially introduced by Carlos Castaneda, and he elaborated somewhat on the first and second, but very little on the third, as I recall. So in the course of the GNE, I was able to pick up that Castaneda syntax and develop it further. I consider the instruction of the three attentions to be absolutely core to Gaian Tantra and to shamanic magic with the Shakti cluster and so forth and so on. Well, quite simply, the first thing that you need to realize and always remember is that the three attentions are obvious to you, but they have not been pointed out to you before by definition, but they operate. You use them and function by them all the time. They're not something that you have to develop. They're something that's already up and running.
So it's about being conscious of them.
Yeah, it's about being, the purpose of the Nawal is to provide syntax And the purpose of the Gnostic teacher is to simply show you how your mind is designed to work. So your mind is designed to work through three modalities of attention. Now you might compare them to gear shifts. Now normally when you're driving a car, if you're in low or first gear, or second or third or fifth, which is cruise, if you're in first, you're not in cruise. You can't be in more than one gear at the same time. But with the three attentions, you are in three gears at the same time. The first gear is just direct perception, sensorial apprehension of what is around you. Just reading the field of what you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell through your senses. And also, incorporated into the first attention is the ability to act by communication, mainly, to form a concept of something that you see and to describe what you see. Okay? The second attention the first attention belongs, therefore, more or less to the realm of the exopsyche, that which is external. The second attention is comprised of two parts. The primary function of it is everything that is comprised in the work of the subconscious. Dreaming is a function of the second attention. There are two specialized functions of the second attention, dreaming and memory. But in general, it's a vast package of activities and processes, free association, sitting on the beach and just sort of remembering points in your life and just fantasizing. Fantasy is part of the second attention. All of that which belongs to what I call the endopsyche, which technically they call, in Jungian terms, the collective unconscious. I don't like that term, because it's not unconscious. It's actually a subliminal consciousness. Okay? All of that is the second attention, and obviously you're kind of floating in the second attention all the time. You know, you're picking up and dropping memories, and when you go to sleep you dream. That's a function of the second attention. Imagination is a function of the second attention. And the whole key to imagination is to use it correctly and not use it as fantasy, but use it as a higher apprehension of what is real. I said many years ago, the great power of the imagination is not that it allows you to picture or conceive of what might be, but it allows you to picture and conceive of what actually is. When you imagine how things actually are, then you are actually achieving the capacity of imagination, which is the second attention, which is vast field. The third attention is very mysterious, and I think that probably I could blow my own horn here and say that I've probably said more about it than anybody else on the planet. And I have a lot more to say. But basically, I like to use the example of my Chinese girlfriend, Yu Jia Wang. Yu Jia Wang. Now, when Yu Jia Wang plays the third piano concerto of Rachmaninoff, or when she plays the Scriabin Sonata, you see her sitting there at the piano. She's gorgeously beautiful. Got a big red dress on with a long slit up the thigh.
Stunning.
She's a very stunning woman. And she doesn't have a musical score in front of her. How does she do this? Obviously, there was a moment. Let's just take the fifth piano sonata of Scriabin, the poem of ecstasy, which I happen to really love. There was a moment back in time, if you want to use the concept of linear time, when Scriabin wrote down on paper in the notation of musical composers that sonata.
Using the second attention?
Using the second attention, because he imagined it and created it, as a musician. Then that score, I guess that's what they call it, the musical score, eventually came into the hands of Yu Jia Wang. And she heard it played, probably by her teacher, and she studied the score, and she went through a very elaborate process of training. But then when she comes up on the concert stage and sits down, she just channels it That's the third attention. Third attention is a mysterious translation from will to action. Like, you use the third attention all the time. Like, you wake up in the morning, you go in, you stand by the refrigerator there, and maybe you look at a list of things that you have to buy today, and the list reminds you, it triggers your memory, that's your second attention, and reminds you that you have to go to the grocery store. In the meantime, you're making a cup of tea. Well, how do you make the cup of tea?
Because you're in your first attention.
You're in your first attention by paying attention to making the cup of tea, but the actual making of the cup of tea you do with your third attention. I defy anybody to explain to me how you make a cup of tea, because you are in fact commanding your body to go through the actions of making the cup of tea, getting the tea bag, boiling the water, choosing a cup. The cup you choose from the selection of cups on the rack is done with the first attention, but the act of actually reaching up and taking the cup is done with the third attention, and you don't know how you do that. Nobody knows how they do that. The third attention is a mysterious, mechanical, kinetic force operating through the universe. And it is also a mirroring force. And so, how is it a mirroring force? Well, in some odd way, for instance, there's a cup of tea on the table and I'm sitting here and I want to reach out and put my finger through the handle of the mug and drink the tea. Well, I actually mirror that action so that I can perform it. If I'm not able to mirror it, I can't perform it. So if I'm sitting there and I'm not able to mirror it, I can't perform it, and I will just sit there unable to reach the cup of tea. What gives me the capacity to mirror the actions that I perform? That's the third attention. It's present all the time, but it's the most mysterious of the three. And it has extraordinary properties. You use the third attention to bilocate, and I'm talking about physical bilocation, knowing that you are in two places at once. When you have a lucid dream, what is happening is that the third attention is breaking into the second attention in the dreaming mode. Remember that dreaming and memory are sub-functions of the second attention. So when you're dreaming, when you're asleep and you're dreaming, you're in the second attention. But when you have a lucid dream, the third attention breaks in and takes control of the second attention. And that's why you can act voluntarily in the dream the way you can act in normal life, because the third attention gives you that capacity. So it's an endlessly fascinating subject, and it doesn't get any less mysterious the more that you understand it. Believe me, it gets more mysterious.
Would you like to talk just a little bit about Sophia using her third attention?
Yeah, well, I was able to track or detect that the Gaian Sophia was operating in the second attention of the human animal to create the Mandela effect. That was the first thing that I realized within 15 seconds of realizing what the Mandela effect was. I saw that it was a phenomenon, that it was real, and then I realized that she was operating in the second attention, so that's what inspired me to do the talks. But when I began to do those talks, we began to talk about it in July, and then it wasn't until February that I started to do the MED channel. When I began to develop that idea, I didn't see where it was going until it got there. And it got there in October. And then in October of 2017, I detected, again, in a Gnostic way, as an investigator, that she was going to not just operate in the field of the second attention, but she was going to use the third attention directly to move into the exo-psyche of the human animal. Now, this is very complicated matters, but I think that I demonstrated and showed how, I showed the proof of it in the course of that investigation.
Yes, you did.
And I have to say it was a matter of huge amazement to me as I was doing so.
Mm. Okay, we're going to get around now to some other questions in no particular order. And then we've got a very long questions from somebody
Sure.
that John would like to respond to. So we'll do that at the end.
Okay.
So somebody asked, who would you command to do cyber attacks, technology of the psychopaths?
To do cyber attacks.
Yeah.
To counter cyber attacks or to...
Well, okay, off the top of my mind,
Yeah.
there's the Jewish Internet Defence Federation, Foundation, whatever it is. So, you know, they try to steer the narrative and hate speech anyone that's saying anything against their narrative. So if one wanted to command the app
I see.
to attack that particular, you know, because that is a huge Cyanim Xenos technology.
Yes, it is. That's a very good question, you know. I don't have an immediate answer for that. I think that that's an area that needs to be certainly countered because so much evil and deceit is operating through the cyber world.
Oh, yeah, we've been knee deep in that shit for a couple of weeks now, haven't we?
Yeah, we really have. So I'm going to pass on that question for the moment.
Okay, well I'll mark that one for another time. Who would we command in targeting weapons, spraying planes? The person actually used the word harp.
Well, remember that there are two principal apotropaic nodes of the Shakti cluster. Apotropaic means magic used to ward off an evil or nefarious influence. So one of them is 17, which is in the notch of the Shakti cluster, and the other is 13, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I said already that you would command 17 against G5 technology and all those kind of all that kind of weaponry that has nothing to do with you personally. It's just in your environment, you know. But you would use 13, Kurukula, or did I say 9, Matangi? They're very close and similar in their actions to ward off anything that was coming to you in your personal environment. So if someone puts a spell on you, which people do all the time, your parents put a spell on you.
Education,
wake up to that one.
Yeah.
That's a hard one for people to wake up to.
Yeah.
Education puts a spell on you, your professors. Cultural Marxism is a spell. So all of that which is attacking you personally, you would command, I would say, 9 and 13, or Matangi and Kurukula, and you have to test it out. We're all testing this tool, you know. I don't have the ultimate and final formula of how it works here.